City Beautiful movement, which you may have heard of. The best example in Cleveland really is the group, or the plan that the example that we think of the most is the group plan of 1903. And they took what had essentially become a slum at the time and recreated it as Cleveland Civic Center. So that's where we have the malls, the public library, the Board of Education, which is now the Drury Hotel, federal courthouse, county courthouse, and City Hall. And that was part of the City Beautiful movement, was to negate the negative impact that industry and especially the railroad had had on cities by creating overpasses to get people over industry, beautiful parks and parkways and boulevards, creating vistas and commanding architecture. And then there's a lot of that in Buckeye-Shaker. All over the city, there's this park and parkway system. And a lot of times the parkways, the example here is Martin Luther King, which had been East Boulevard, which connects Ambler Park, which we don't really even think of because you have to kind of go look for it to find it. Connects Ambler Park with what had been Woodland Hills Park, is now Luke Easter Park. But this is a great example of the City Beautiful movement, kind of broad streets, winding, meandering, rather than being on the grid like most of the city. Big setbacks, big trees and tree lawns, and landscaping. And there's examples other places like in Glenville, East Boulevard connects, runs along Rockefeller Park and connects Gordon Park to Wade Park. On the west side, Edgewater Park is connected with Cudell Park on West Boulevard, by West Boulevard. So an example of the City Beautiful movement. And they like commanding vistas at the end of the street. So when you go up Fair Hill, you see the Baldwin Waterworks, beautiful neoclassical building. This is the Marine Hospital that I talked about, which was built where that Lacey Mansion had been. And this still exists. It's kind of unfortunate. You know, it looks like this, and this is Fair Hill. You might know it by this little bench that they've uncovered there on the sidewalk. But unfortunately, in the early 70s, they built a really ugly, brutalist addition on the front. So you don't really see that there's actually a beautiful neoclassical complex there. And then the streetcar lines had a big impact. The Cleveland Railway Company formed in 1910, and there were about 38 lines that ran throughout Cleveland until the early 50s when they were disbanded in favor of buses. But when you have a streetcar line like they did on Buckeye, it increases the value of all the land there. And this coincided with the beginning of really fire laws and the early planning movement. So buildings tend to be brick, they're built kind of densely together. And it's interesting to me, in the early 20th century, we seem to be very experimental about architecture. So houses, instead of doing these revival styles that they had done previously, they started doing brand new things like American four squares and bungalows. And those are really, they're building types that you know by the shape and the form of the building, and they can kind of wear different clothes. You know, depending on what kind of porch posts they have, they can look more colonial or they can look more arts and crafts. And the same thing is true of commercial buildings that you see on Buckeye. This is known as it's now known as the early 20th century commercial style. And it's because it was kind of brand new, and you can't say this is you know, any architectural style that existed previously. They're brick buildings with stone ornamentation, shaped parapets, which are the parts that stick up here, tapestry brick. Here you see shaped parapets and tapestry brick. And I thought it's interesting also how building uses changed over time. This building on Buckeye had been an A&P in the early 60s, and by the late 60s it was an import house and a couple of other Hungarian businesses. And I thought that was interesting, but after the 1956 revolution in Hungary, there was a new wave of Hungarian immigrants, and it's my understanding that Buckeye took on even more ethnic flavor in the late 60s, more identified with the Hungarian community. Again, like these shaped parapets, this is early 20th century commercial style, and these buildings are mixed use, and they're interesting because they kind of create a transition between the commercial and the residential. They're still residential, but they're kind of on the, you can see purely commercial and then residential and then single family houses. You'll also notice there are denser nodes of this because of the streetcar and where they stopped along the route. They're denser nodes on corners. And sometimes you might have a commercial corner and then a stretch of residential. And a lot of the residential had, over time then, also became commercial with these additions on the front. This is another part of Buckeye Road I thought was interesting. I got on MapQuest because really it looked exactly the same, the house, the commercial buildings, except there was this addition on the front of the house here. And I think that's true of a lot of Buckeye, that so much of it hasn't really changed over time.